talking to a couple of guys before the lesson, and I read the title, and yeah, this is going to be a short devotion because it's on women. And if a fellow's smart, of course, I always reference when I can the aged wisdom of our number, and Pete's looking at me. So I asked Pete, "What do you think?" He said, "Well, I know this. Jacob worked for 14 years for nothing and ended up with 2 women." Now, there was a positive side, though, because he immediately went into the praises of his wife of 60-something years. So, I think he tried to cover himself quite well. But I just would like to point out that Proverbs 31:10 is not a rhetorical question. Who can find a virtuous wife? Like, yeah, right. No, this is in character with Proverbs. Proverbs is a great number of statements about wisdom, and very often it's the ideal that's presented to us, not that we have that to perfection. Train up a child in the way they should go, and when they're old, they'll not depart from it. Well, that's not 100% true in the sense of its actual pragmatic use. If it were the case, though, that it's always the parents' fault that the kids go wrong, then we should probably blame God for Adam and Eve. No, we're not going to do that. And parents can do the best they can and raise their child properly, and sometimes children make poor decisions. So it's not the parents' fault once a child gets to a certain age that they make poor decisions, although they can implement, or not implement, but influence the decisions that these children make if they don't do their job as parents. So what we're looking at is a general overview of what can be the goal that we look for. And we know this is the case because it talks about the woman, this virtuous wife, you know it's speaking in generalities when it goes over to verse 12. She does him good and not evil all the days of her life. Now, I won't even ask the husbands, but I will ask the wives. Can you say that honestly? That all the days of your husband's life, you did him good all the time. So obviously we're looking at a generic set of statements here, but what is very important to understand is that a lot of the concepts are figments of people's imaginations today concerning roles and concerning a woman's position in the world, and particularly in things like worship assemblies, in the home, and things of that nature, is very skewed and warped in our culture today. They don't go to the Bible in the first place to get their definitions, or they would have a much different idea. But you'll notice that the context of this falls within the wisdom literature, Proverbs. And so we have, as a conclusion of the wisdom literature, a virtuous wife. And by the way, at the last end of it, and this is a spoiler kind of thing, in verse 30, charm is deceitful and beauty is passing. So much of our culture bases the value of a woman on her appearance. And such should not be the case. No, as a matter of fact, quite the contrary. The inside of a woman is what's important. Now, I realize, I just saw it a while ago, that Alta has a black heart, okay? That's just the way it is, because it's hanging around her neck. She has a black heart all around her neck. But no, it's the internal, and she's as sweet as a bug. And so it's the internal part of a woman that really actually makes her beautiful. And that's what this is going to be about. The entire study about a virtuous wife, a virtuous woman in the King James translation, it's actually, I think, should be a virtuous wife. You're looking at a partner. As a matter of fact, it starts out with a recognition that even our culture struggles with, because when a man and a woman come together, Genesis 1:24, you're looking at a situation, 2:24, you're looking at a situation where a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to her husband, and the twain will be one flesh, until the kids come along, and then all of a sudden the kids are more important than the husband. No, but that is how it happens in our culture very often today. No, as a matter of fact, when you start with finding a virtuous wife whose value is above rubies, I mean, there is so much, like so many things that are valuable in God's eyes. The things that we look at and assign great value to and importance to really aren't when it comes down to it. I can speak from a few years, 48 or so, that, having a good, virtuous wife. In fact, I started to do this sermon and just get up. Who can find a virtuous wife? Well, I found her. Thank you very much. The invitation's offered. Didn't get down. But no, that wouldn't float. But the whole point is that very often what we value in life is not really what has great value. And our relationships on this planet are secondary only to our relationship to God. And so one of the most important relationship we have on the planet is our relationship with our wife. That oneness that we ought to have and that we ought to develop and work at, that's what we're talking about in this context. And it is a point of wisdom on the part of the wife to recognize what her value is, and to begin with, what her value is to her husband. Because when a wife appreciates what her husband does and provides and is, as far as God is concerned, in that role, then she will value him to the degree that he's going to implicitly trust her. Okay, that's the husbands that are perfect. Again, we're talking about individuals and the goals we have to set, the goals we want to set and try to achieve. Is very much, as Paul would say, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And I have yet to make that perfection. Maybe you have, but I certainly haven't. So when we look at the wives, look at three categories I think that are phenomenally just detailed almost in this text. And I'm not going to go through each verse and do a textual on each verse, but look generally what is important. I mean, you start with the idea that you're married to a husband, and your husband has an influence with you, and you with your husband, to the degree that you're a team, you work together. As a matter of fact, it's important that the wife view the husband appropriately and the husband view the wife appropriately. And when that happens, there is a manifestation of it in society. Notice what it talks about in verse 23. Her husband is known in the gates. Now, remember, this is the context here. The context is about a virtuous wife. So why mention this? Well, because, wives, you have a very large influence on your husband and how your husband is viewed. And it's important that you understand that in order to be the best wife you can, so that your husband does not have shame because of who his wife is. And of course, I've said it before, I'll say it the rest of my life. I don't respect women who publicly, particularly, but publicly disrespect, disregard, and put down their husbands. Because it just shows the intelligence factor that you had involved when you picked the guy wasn't way up there on the totem pole. Evidently, you didn't pick well, if that's the opinion you have of your husband. It says a lot when a wife will be able to say all good things about their husband, particularly publicly. And you don't have to flatter, you don't have to lie. You can find things good about the husband, but his reputation is good, and part of the reason his reputation is good is because of the wife. And when you look at this context, this is quite the challenge for a woman. It really is. In fact, I don't know many men who can do half as good. I do get tickled, though, sometimes that people twist things a little bit and don't realize some of the priorities that goes with being a good woman. And not a demotion in a role, but the priority and the importance of the role. You know, 3 times in verse 15, in verse 21, and also in verse 27, household is used. Now, it's not as though the man has no place in the household, although sometimes she would want to kick him out. But no, it's not as he has no responsibilities in the household. As a matter of fact, husbands are told fathers are told, don't provoke your children to wrath, but discipline them appropriately. Now, fathers have a leading role in the family, no doubt. But it's interesting to me that 3 times in this text, the household is mentioned as a priority for the women. As a matter of fact, in Titus 2:5, it talks about women being keepers at home. Now, that does not mean, as many feminists would assert, that a woman is out of place if she's out of the home in any way. Not true. In fact, the reading of this would just totally blitz that. But nevertheless, there is a priority in God's terms for a woman to understand that her husband and her children, her household, are priorities. And you go through the things that she does in order to keep her household in a proper way. And I'm sorry, it's terribly extensive. I mean, she does not eat the bread of idleness, and I don't see how that even fits in there when you look at all the things that's required to be that consummate wife, that consummate woman in the household. So it's a tremendous set of criteria as a parameter, something to reach for that is stated there. But the household definitely has to be a priority. But that does not exclude working outside the home, doing things outside the home. As a matter of fact, I'd argue verse 16, she ought to be a good real estate agent. She considers a field and buys it, profits when she plants a vineyard. There's all kinds of things that she can do outside the home that benefits her household. It's not as though she sins if she works outside the house. Her strength is such that she opens her mouth with wisdom in verse 26, and with kindness. She has the law of kindness on her tongue. She watches her ways and so forth. And you look at the setup of someone who is doing things for her household. Part of what she did for her household was outside the home. As a matter of fact, and I had it marked up here somewhere, had to do with merchants. Verse 24. She makes linen garments and sells them and supplies sashes for the merchants. Evidently, she's quite the adept businesswoman also. You know, the limitations that so many would like to artificially place on women today in our culture don't belong there if you read the Bible correctly. There's a ton of things that women are not only very adept at, but can do quite well. Now, I'm going to go old-fashioned on you, especially after reading the Secretary of War's book here recently, War on Warriors, where he makes the comment that we ought not to put our females, because there's only two genders, quote unquote, male and female, we should not put our females on the front line and turn them into killers. That's not an appropriate place for a woman, and I'll stand behind that. Nevertheless, what you see in here is a woman who is willing to defend her family and do everything possible to help her family. There are roles that we men and women play that God has set up for us, and this is very explicit as to what those dividing lines should be. Nevertheless, she is a great household keeper, a housekeeper. She is a great businesswoman or an entrepreneur, and these are both very critical, but the thing that really sticks out is in the last, and that is the appreciation of her value. It doesn't have to do with superficial things, particularly her looks. And as I said earlier, we live in a culture where that's what it's all about, how one looks. Now, I'm not saying that women, you need to just go ahead and look scabby and not worry about how you look. That's not what I'm saying. There's an appropriate way to present oneself in public that is dignified and complimentary to you. You ought to worry and concern yourself about those things, but not value yourself because of how you look. I'm just almost overwhelmed by some of the terms that people use nowadays that are such a problem, especially since we've got TikTok and Facebook and a lot of other things. Fat shaming. You know, tall, short, wide, thin, it does not matter. What's in the heart is what really matters. And not all men or women are made the same, and we put way too much value upon how someone looks instead of what their heart is. When you look at verse 30, and the whole thing comes to a gel as a conclusion in this thing. Charm is deceitful and beauty is passing. And I'm telling you, as we get older, it's harder and harder for Kelly to believe that, honey, you look better than you've ever looked before. Okay, that's not a lie. I am using glasses and going blind, but that's beside the point. I see more of who she is, and as many of you men understand and do, you see more of who the person is in their heart. And that's what makes people beautiful. And so therefore, I call some ladies here sweet lady. Kind of annoys a couple of them, but that's okay. I'm looking at their heart. I see what their potential and capability is, but particularly I see the manifestation of what sweet, nice, kind, loving people do. And so therefore, charm is deceitful and beauty is passing, but the woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. And that is an open-ended statement. I believe it's talking particularly about God, saying this is the kind of woman I want to see. This is the one who will be praised. But frankly, good husbands, good men will recognize a good woman and praise her for it. Good children and good young people will see the beauty and dignity of older women and not look at just the outside frame, but look at the interior and see that she should be praised. Give her the fruit of her hands and let her own works praise her in the gates. It's interesting to me, just like the theme of the entire Bible, the manifestations of the inside show. They come out. They can be seen. and that's what we look for. It's quite a high bar, as is all of the Proverbs, as is all of Christian living today. If you're God's child, the bar is intentionally set high by God. And so, yeah, you look at this, it's not easy. I understand why. Very often in women's studies, this text comes up and is gone through in much more detail than I have today. But I'll guarantee you this, the bar is set high, not because it's that impossible dream, but because it can be reached by individuals who dedicate their life to God and dedicate their life to their husband and to their family and to those they love and care about, and even to those who are strangers. One of those is put in here. She extends her hand to the poor in verse 20. She reaches out her hands to the needy. This is just the attitude that a person has when they're what God wants them to be. Also, much more can be said about this that I'll forego. But I can tell you this is a metric that we ought to be reaching. Women ought to look at this text and say, this is the pattern that I need to follow in order to be someone God praises and says, that's my daughter in the faith. And we ought to encourage men, just to make this practical and applicable to everybody. We men, when women do things that are very praiseworthy, we ought to go about praising them for their work. And they did a wonderful job on today's lunch, I just might add. Although there were some men involved in that, but we have a standard set for us here that is very lofty, but it can be reached. And so the question was asked, who can find a virtuous wife? Well, evidently God expected those of us who are looking to find one to develop, to appreciate, and be in gratitude, because we have those amongst us and present. Now, this did not accommodate an invitation, but one of the interesting characteristics of we, the church, is that we are the bride of Christ. And so if you really want to get into it, a great number of these, in principle, these things talked about in the virtuous wife, they apply to us in a general way, all of us, in order for us to live the way we ought to live. I'd invite you, if you're not a Christian, to be one, but I'd invite you, if you are a Christian, look at these again from a generic standpoint and say, how many of these can I honestly say I'm living and fulfilling and doing as I should, being the kind of person God could be praising because we're His child. If you're subject to the invitation in any way, won't you respond as we stand together and stand?